The Girl in the Shadows. The world woke up in stages at Ashenvale. First came the darkness before darkness, that peculiar, pressing hour when even the stars seemed to hold their breath, when the entire fortress sat submerged beneath a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. Then came the slow, reluctant bleed of gray along the eastern ridge, painting the stone battlements in the color of old ash. Then came the wind off the Thornmere, cold and sharp and smelling of pine resin and something older, something wild, a smell that the people of Ashenvale had no single word for but recognized in their bones as the smell of the dragons sleeping in their pens below the eastern yard. And then, before any bell had rung or any torch had been lit in the great hall, before the kitchen fires had been stoked and the bread dough set to rise, a small figure slipped through the narrow servants' corridor that ran between the scullery and the outer wall, pressed herself into the deep shadow of a stone archway, and became very, very still. Her name was Lyra. She was 17 years old. She had gray eyes the color of river water in winter and dark hair that she kept pinned back with a strip of linen because she could not afford the bone pins that the other girls used. Her hands were rough from lye soap and cold water, her knuckles perpetually cracked, her forearms carrying the small pale scars that every kitchen servant collected over time, the brush of a hot pan rim here, the slip of a knife there. She wore a working apron that had been washed so many times it had faded from brown to the color of old cream, and she smelled of wood smoke and flour, and the faint underlying sweetness of the honey she had been jarring the night before. She looked to anyone who might have glanced her way like exactly what she was, a kitchen servant who had no business being anywhere near the Royal Dragon training yard. No one glanced her way, no one ever did. That was the particular gift and particular curse of Lyra's life at Ashenvale. She had perfected the art of invisibility not through any magic or deliberate craft, but through years of quiet necessity. She had learned early that invisible girls were safe girls. Invisible girls did not attract the attention of head cooks with short tempers or stable masters with wandering hands. Invisible girls moved through the corridors of great fortresses like water through cracks in stone, present, essential, and utterly unremarked upon. She had worn her invisibility the way other people wore armor, and it had served her well enough. But here in this archway at this hour, her invisibility was something different. Here it was not protection, here it was a kind of ache. Because from this archway, through the gap between the iron-banded gate and the rough-cut stone of the eastern wall, she could see the training yard. And in the training yard, just after dawn, the hatchlings were brought out. The first time Lyra had stumbled onto this view had been 3 weeks ago, entirely by accident. She had been sent to deliver a wrapped parcel of smoked meat to the auxiliary storeroom near the eastern wall, a task she had never been given before and has not been given since. And in her unfamiliarity with that part of the fortress, she had taken a wrong turn, followed the smell of something warm and animal and alive, and found herself pressed against the archway with her heart in her throat and her parcel forgotten in her arms. She had seen the hatchlings, and something inside her chest had cracked open like an egg. She could not have explained it then, and she could not explain it now, 3 weeks later, standing in the same archway with goosebumps rising on her flower-dusted arms. It was not that she had never seen dragons before. Everyone at Ashenvale had seen the great adult dragons, the massive war-aged creatures that the crown kept chained to the high towers for ceremony and intimidation, their scales dull and their eyes glassy with years of confinement. She had seen those beasts the way one sees a monument, with the understanding that they were significant, impressive, and entirely separate from anything that had to do with her own small life. The hatchlings were something else entirely. They were the size of large hounds still, though they would not stay that way. Their scales had not yet hardened into the iron-thick plating of adults, but had the quality of something between leather and stone, flexible, warm to the touch, she imagined, patterned in colors that would deepen and darken as they aged. They moved with a young animal's combination of clumsiness and sudden fluid grace, all knobbled joints and oversized feet and wings that were still too large for their bodies and kept getting in the way, tripping them sideways, catching wind they had not meant to catch and startling them into each other. They were ridiculous, they were extraordinary. They were, in a way that Lyra felt in her sternum rather than her brain, the most alive things she had ever seen. There were 9 of them in this clutch. 8 were of common coloring, the deep reddish-black that the crown's breeding line favored, built for heat and endurance and the kind of terrible obedience that won wars. They were already showing the blunt, aggressive angles of their bloodline, their snouts broad and their necks thick, their eyes a sullen amber that watched everything with flat suspicion. And then there was the silver one. It stood always every morning without fail slightly apart from the others. Not isolated exactly, not excluded, but offset, the way a musician in an ensemble sometimes holds a single beat of silence while everyone else plays. Its scales were the color of birch bark, pale gray-white with faint undertones of blue that caught the early light in ways the other hatchlings' coloring never did. Its horn, the short forward-curving horn that all hatchlings of this lineage grew in their first months, had come in slightly crooked, angled a few degrees to the left, as though it had decided partway through growing that it was not entirely committed to the expected direction. Its eyes were not amber. They were violet, pale and deep at the same time, the color of the sky at the exact moment between dusk and dark. It was this one that had first noticed Lyra. She had not done anything to attract its attention. She had simply stood in her archway and tried not to breathe too loudly, and the silver hatchling had lifted its head mid-drill, turned away from the training target it was supposed to be snapping at, and looked directly at her with those violet eyes as though she had called its name. Lyra had frozen, sure she was about to be discovered, sure the hatchling's obvious interest would draw Master Corvin's gaze to the archway and her trespassing presence would be exposed. But Corvin had been at the far end of the yard and the moment had passed, and the silver hatchling had held her gaze for 3 long heartbeats before slowly, deliberately, lowering its head back toward the ground. Not in submission, not in disinterest, more like acknowledgement, more like I see you there, I know you're watching, you may continue. Lyra had pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. She had come back the next morning, and the morning after that, and every morning since. The routine had established itself with the quiet persistence of something that had always been true and simply needed time to surface. Lyra would slip from the kitchen corridor before the bread-rising bell, navigate the servants' passage by memory and touch, and take up her position in the archway. She would stand with her back against the stone and her shoulder just barely past the edge of the gate, visible from inside the yard only if one knew exactly where to look. She would watch. And the silver hatchling would find her. Every time, within minutes of being led into the yard, it would orient itself with that particular tilt of the head, that slight flare of the nostrils. She had come to understand that it was scenting her, that her particular combination of kitchen smells had become a signal the creature recognized, and it would turn its pale violet gaze to the archway and settle. That was the word for it precisely, settle. The high-strung, twitchy alertness that characterized the hatchlings in the early minutes of every training session would ease out of the silver one's body the moment it located her. Its shoulders would drop fractionally. Its breathing would slow to something even and rhythmic. The constant flicker of its wings, that nervous half-spreading that young dragons did when they felt uncertain, would still. And then, almost without exception, the other hatchlings would settle too. Not because they were watching Lyra. She did not think most of them even knew she was there. But they were watching the silver one, reading it the way herd animals read, the most alert among them, taking their cues from its body and its bearing. When the silver hatchling was calm, the yard was calmer. When it was still, the others were stiller. It was a quiet, unassuming kind of leadership, the sort that did not announce itself, and Lyra recognized it with a pang of something she could not quite name because she understood that kind too. The kind that happened in the background. The kind that no one credited or noticed. She never stepped into the yard. She had never once crossed that threshold, never let her foot leave the shadow of the archway and press against the pale dirt of the training ground. She understood the line between watching and intrusion, and she held to it with the same careful discipline that had kept her invisible for years. She had nothing to offer the silver hatchling except her presence and her attention, and some instinct she couldn't articulate told her that for now, those were the right things to offer. Not food, not touch. Not the kind of forced familiarity that Corvin practiced with his lead ropes and his spine whip. Just the steady fact of her, morning after morning, watching without wanting anything in return. She was not sure she could have explained why that felt important, only that it did. Master Corvin arrived at the training yard each morning like weather. There was no subtlety to the man, no gradation, he was simply absent, and then he was present, and the quality of the air in the yard changed immediately when he crossed into it. He was tall and broad through the chest, somewhere past 50, with a close-cropped gray beard and hands that were enormous and scarred from decades of working around creatures that could and frequently did bite. He wore the dark green uniform of the Royal Training Corps, and carried himself with the absolute, unquestioned authority of a man who had never once been told he was wrong about anything in his professional life. He was not a cruel man, precisely. Lyra had turned this question over in her mind many mornings, watching him work, trying to arrive at a fair assessment. He did not seem to take pleasure in the hatchlings' fear. He did not linger over their flinching or their distress. But he had decided somewhere in his long career that fear was a training tool like any other, efficient, reliable, producing measurable results, and he applied it with the same businesslike detachment that he applied everything else. The spine whip was cracked against the ground, not against scales most of the time. The hatchling startled and scrambled and obeyed, and Corvin made his notations in his ledger and moved on to the next drill. He was building soldiers, he knew how to build soldiers. What he did not know, and what Lyra suspected he had never considered worth knowing, was what the hatchlings were when they were not being drilled. What they were when they nudged each other for warmth in the cold early mornings, pressing their scaled sides together and breathing slow synchronized breaths. What they were when the silver one found something interesting on the ground. A beetle, a pebble of unusual color, a feather dropped from one of the tower ravens and brought it over to show the others, nosing it forward with that crooked horn, apparently for no reason other than that it found the thing worth sharing. What they were, underneath all the drilling and the flinching and the careful obedient terror, was young, curious, social in the deeply particular way that intelligent creatures were social, not just seeking warmth and safety but actively, specifically interested in the world and in each other. Corvin looked at them and saw potential military assets. Lyra looked at them and saw people. Smaller, scalier, breathtakingly more physically dangerous, yes, but people. This was not a thought she had ever said aloud. It would have marked her as foolish at best and unstable at worst, and she had worked too hard at her invisibility to risk it on an opinion about dragons. So she kept the thought where she kept most of her thoughts, pressed close against the inside of her ribs, private and warm and entirely her own. By the third week, small things had begun to shift in ways that Lyra noticed even if no one else did. The silver hatchling had started watching the archway before she arrived. She had discovered this one morning when she had been delayed by a spilled crock of stock that she'd had to help mop up before she could slip away. And when she had finally taken her place in the archway nearly 20 minutes later than usual, the silver one had been standing with its body angled toward the gate and its head raised, clearly waiting, clearly aware that something was late that was normally on time. The realization had floored her. She had stood in the archway with her heart doing something uncomfortable and complicated, and the silver hatchling had looked at her for a long moment with those violet eyes, and then slowly, with a dignity that she found deeply affecting in something roughly knee-height, looked away. It was forgiving her, she thought, for being late. She had pressed her forehead against the cold stone of the archway and breathed through something that was not quite crying but was adjacent to it. And then she had straightened up and watched the rest of the training session with extra attention, as though she could make up the missed time through intensity. The other shifts were subtler, but they accumulated. The 8 red-black hatchlings had stopped flinching at the crack of the spine whip quite as violently as they had in the first week, not because they had grown accustomed to it exactly, but because the silver one barely reacted to it at all, and they took their cues from the silver one, and the silver one was calm because Lyra was in the archway and Lyra was still. She had not intended to provide this service. She had simply been standing there. But the result was measurable, morning after morning, in the way the yard moved from barely controlled chaos toward something closer to genuine attention. She wondered sometimes whether Corvin had noticed, whether he had looked at the improvement in his training sessions and asked himself what had changed. But if he had asked the question, he had clearly not arrived at the answer, because he kept running his drills the same way, cracking his whip the same way, making his notations in his ledger with the same satisfied efficiency of a man who believed the results were the product of his own methods. She did not begrudge him the credit. She had never expected credit for anything. There was one morning, 10 days into the 3 weeks, when the silver hatchling did something that made Lyra's breath catch hard enough that she had to press her fist against her sternum to quiet it. Corvin had been drilling the hatchlings on territorial positioning, a drill that involved the animals establishing and holding a perimeter around a marked center point, while Corvin walked a slow circuit around the outside, occasionally making sudden loud noises to test their startle response. It was a drill the hatchlings hated. The sudden sounds made them scatter, and Corvin would note the break in the perimeter formation and begin the drill again from the start. His expression the flat disapproving mask of a man collecting data and finding it insufficient. The silver hatchling was particularly poor at this drill, not because it scattered, it didn't, it held its position with a steadiness that the other 8 could not quite manage, but because it kept turning its head toward the archway during the quiet intervals between the sudden noises. And each time it turned away from the center point, it broke the formation in a technical sense even while holding it physically. Corvin had stopped the drill and crouched down in front of the silver hatchling, which was never a good sign, and he had said something to it in the low, firm tone he used when he was making a correction. Something about attention and discipline and the direction its gaze was supposed to be directed. The silver hatchling had listened to all of this with its head tilted very slightly, the crooked horn catching the morning light at an angle that made it look, improbably, like it was thinking. And then when Corvin had finished speaking and stood up and turned away to reset the drill, the silver hatchling had turned its head one final time toward the archway, looked directly at Lyra for exactly 3 seconds. She had counted. She didn't know why. She had simply found herself counting, and then turned back to its position and fixed its gaze on the center point with an attention so deliberate and pointed that it was clearly a choice. It had heard Corvin. It had understood or understood something about what was being asked. And it had looked at Lyra as though checking, as though asking, and then it had turned back and done the thing it had been asked to do. Not because it was afraid of Corvin. Lyra was certain of that. She had watched this creature's relationship with fear for 3 weeks, and she knew the difference between the way it moved when it was frightened, low, pulled in, wings pressed flat, and the way it moved now. It had done what it was asked because it had decided to, because the decision had been its own. She thought about that for a long time afterward. She thought about it while she was scrubbing stock pots and sweeping ashes and doing all the other invisible necessary tasks of her invisible necessary life. She thought about what it meant to do what you were asked, not from fear but from something chosen. She thought about whether she had ever done anything from something chosen. She thought about what it would feel like to have someone check in with her that way, to look at her as though her presence mattered to a decision. She did not arrive at any comfortable conclusions. She never did, on the mornings after the silver hatchling had done something that reached into her chest and rearranged things. She simply set her hands back to the work in front of her and counted the hours until the next dawn. The gray Tuesday morning that changed everything began, like all the others, with Lyra in her archway, her shoulder against the stone, her eyes on the yard. She did not know, standing there in the dark, just beginning to soften toward gray, with the smell of pine resin and wild old things in the wind and the small sounds of the hatchlings waking in their pens, the low resonant sounds they made, halfway between breathing and something that had no word yet, that this would be the last morning she stood in the shadows. She did not know that by the time the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, everything would be different. She only knew what she always knew at this hour, standing here, the cold stone at her back and the small pale glow of violet eyes finding her through the gate, and something in her chest that she had no name for but had been growing for 3 weeks into something large and stubborn and entirely, stubbornly alive. She settled into her shadow, she watched. The silver hatchling found her and breathed easier. And the morning held its breath, the way mornings do just before they break. To be continued in Part 2, The Crack of the Whip. The Crack of the Whip. The gray Tuesday morning arrived without apology. There was no softness to it, no gentle gradation from night into day the way some mornings offered, those rare honeyed dawns that came in summer when the light seemed almost apologetic about disturbing the dark. This morning came in hard and flat, the sky the color of old pewter from edge to edge, the clouds pressing down low over the Thornmere Ridge as though the sky itself had decided to make itself a ceiling and leave no room for anything tall or reaching or hopeful. The wind off the water was sharper than it had been all week, carrying ice in its teeth, and the stones of Ashenvale's eastern wall had collected a thin skin of frost overnight that caught the thin gray light and gave the yard the look of something preserved, something held deliberately still under glass. Lyra felt the cold through her apron and her sleeves and the thin linen of her underdress, felt it the way she felt all the physical facts of her life, with a sort of resigned acknowledgement that was not quite acceptance and not quite resistance but something flattened between the two. She had been standing in the archway for nearly 20 minutes already waiting because she had arrived early. She had not meant to arrive early. She had simply woken before the kitchen bell and found she could not return to sleep, some low and wordless unease moving through her like a current under still water. And after 20 minutes of lying with her eyes open on her narrow cot, she had gotten up and come here, because here was the only place that particular unease ever fully quieted. She breathed slowly and watched the sky and waited for the hatchlings to be brought out. The unease did not fully quiet this morning. It sat at the base of her throat like something swallowed wrong, neither dissolving nor moving, and she found herself turning over the small details of the yard with more than her usual attention. The way the frost had stiffened the dirt of the training ground into irregular peaks and ridges, the way the lid ropes hung on their hook near the pen gate with a quality of readiness that was somehow different from simply being there, the way the torch at the yard's far corner was burning with a tight, wind-stressed flame that kept pulling sideways and righting itself and pulling sideways again. She could not name what was wrong, she only knew that something was. Master Corvin arrived with a different quality to him this morning. Lyra had learned over 3 weeks to read the man's moods from a distance and through the filter of his professional composure, the way a sailor learns to read the subtle surface shifts that precede a weather change. There was Corvin in a routine morning, efficient and brisk, his satisfaction contained in the precise economy of his movements. There was Corvin mildly displeased, which expressed itself in a slightly shorter stride and a slightly higher angle to his chin. There was Corvin privately satisfied, which was the rarest of the variations, appearing only on the mornings when the previous day's drills had gone particularly well, and which expressed itself as a nearly invisible easing around his eyes. This morning's Corvin was none of those. He crossed the yard from the upper gate with the controlled surface-level evenness of a man who had decided how he was going to appear and was committing to it fully. But underneath that decision, leaking through the edges of it in small, telling ways, the set of his jaw, the deliberate measured placement of each footfall, the way his right hand had already found the handle of the spine whip at his belt and was resting there with a familiarity that was less habit and more intention was something else, something tight. something that had been wound overnight and not released. Lyra did not know what had wound it. She only knew, with the particular knowledge of people who have spent their lives reading Rooms for Danger, that it was wound, and that wound things eventually released, and that the direction of the release was not yet determined. She stayed very still in her archway, she breathed shallowly, she watched. The hatchlings were brought out by the two junior handlers who assisted at morning drills, young men barely older than Lyra herself, whose primary function appeared to be absorbing the hatchlings' early morning chaos and channeling it toward the training area without losing any animals or any fingers in the process. They managed this with the competent, slightly frantic energy of people doing a job they had not yet fully mastered, calling low instructions to each other across the noise of 9 young dragons, objecting in various registers to the cold and the frost and the early hour, and the general indignity of being led anywhere by a rope. The red-black 8 came out in their usual loose cluster, shoulder to shoulder the way they always were, their amber eyes moving over the yard with that flat, suspicious alertness that never fully left them even in their most settled moments. They were bigger than they had been 3 weeks ago. Lyra tracked it every morning, the barely perceptible but accumulating growth of young things fed well and worked hard, their necks thicker, their shoulders broader, the juvenile softness of their snouts beginning to resolve into the blunter, heavier planes of adult bone structure. The silver one came out last. It always came out last. Not because it was the most difficult to lead, it wasn't, it moved with the junior handlers with a cooperative ease that none of the 8 managed, but because it always paused at the pen threshold for exactly a moment, that crooked horn dipped slightly, its pale body oriented outward with a quality of attention that looked less like hesitation and more like listening, as though it was checking something about the yard before entering it, as though it was reading the morning. This morning it paused at the threshold for longer than usual. Lyra saw this. She watched the silver hatchling stand at the edge of the pen gate with its nostrils working and its violet eyes moving slowly across the yard, and she felt the thing at the base of her throat tighten incrementally, because the silver one was reading the same morning she was reading and arriving at something. Then it found her in the archway, as it always did. Their eyes met across the frost-stiffened yard, gray winter light lying flat between them. The silver hatchling held her gaze for a beat longer than usual, 2 beats longer, and something moved in those violet eyes that she had no word for. Something that was not quite communication and not quite warning, but occupied the space adjacent to both. Then it walked into the yard, and the junior handlers led it to its position, and Master Corvin cracked the spine whip once against the frozen ground to call the formation to attention, and the morning's drilling began. For the first 20 minutes, nothing was wrong in any visible way. The drills were standard, the territory hold formations that the hatchlings had been working on all week, interspersed with the snap-and-release exercises that Corvin used to sharpen the aggressive instincts that the Crown's dragon breeding program considered essential. The red-black 8 moved through the drills with their usual mix of capability and barely suppressed tension, responding to Corvin's commands with the speed of creatures that understood the consequences of not responding and had decided compliance was preferable to the alternative. The silver hatchling moved through the same drills with its own characteristic quality, technically compliant, executing each command with precision, but maintaining throughout a kind of interior reserve, a sense that its body was doing one thing while some deeper attention of its was occupied elsewhere. It was the quality that frustrated Corvin most about the animal, Lyra had observed. He wanted not just obedience but total commitment, the complete flooding of the creature's attention into the task at hand. The silver one gave him its body fully and its full attention never, and he could not find a method to close that gap. This morning he seemed more aware of the gap than usual. Lyra watched him watching the silver hatchling during the formation drills, and she saw the quality of his attention change, sharpen, specifically in the way attention sharpens when it stops observing and starts prosecuting. He was not just noting the silver one's performance this morning. He was building a case against it. She recognized this too. She had seen this kind of attention directed at people in the kitchen, the head cook assembling grievances over the course of a morning until she had enough of them to justify something she had already decided she wanted to do. The grievances were real enough in those cases and in this one. The silver hatchling was technically slightly late on 2 of its snap commands. It turned its head toward the archway twice during the formation hold, breaking its sight line from the center point. On the 3rd formation drill, when Corvin made one of his sudden loud noises from the yard's edge, the silver one did not flinch and did not break, which should have been a point in its favor. But its non-reaction was so composed, so clearly the product of a creature that had decided the noise was not worth reacting to rather than a creature that had been properly trained not to react, that it landed in the yard with the quality of a small, quiet insubordination. Corvin's jaw tightened. His right hand moved to the spine whip handle and rested there again. Lyra held herself very still. The breaking point came at the end of the fourth formation drill. The hatchlings had been held in territory formation for nearly 6 minutes, a long time for young dragons with the constitutional restlessness of all young creatures, and the red-black eight were beginning to show the strain of it in the flicker of their wings and the subtle shifting of their weight. Corvin was doing a slow circuit of the formation perimeter, checking the spacing between animals, stopping occasionally to make small corrections with a word or a gesture. He reached the silver hatchling and stopped. The silver one was holding its position with perfect physical precision, spacing correct, weight balanced, wings flat, but its head was turned for the third time that morning toward the archway, toward Lyra. It was not a dramatic or defiant gesture. It was simply a head turn, the natural orientation of an animal's attention toward the thing that most held it, and it held its body in perfect compliance while its attention was somewhere else entirely. Corvin stood behind the silver hatchling and looked at the angle of its head and the direction of its gaze, and Lyra watched the calculation happen across the distance of the yard, watched him follow the animal's line of sight, watched his eyes track slowly across the frost-hardened ground toward the gate and the archway beyond it. She pressed herself back against the stone, her heart slamming. The angle was wrong, he couldn't see her from where he stood, the gate's iron frame blocked the direct line, but she felt the near miss of discovery like a cold hand around her spine. Corvin looked back at the silver hatchling. He said something. She was too far to hear the words, only the register of his voice, low and controlled and carrying that particular tightness of a man who was running out of the patience he had decided to deploy. The silver hatchling slowly, with that unhurried deliberateness that characterized everything it did, turned its head back toward the center point. Corvin watched this for a moment, then he made a notation in his ledger, then he resumed his circuit of the formation. Lyra allowed herself to breathe again, slowly through her nose. The formation drill ended. Corvin called the end of it with the double crack of the whip that signaled a break before the next sequence, and the hatchlings shifted and resettled, and the junior handlers moved through the group with water skins and the small lean strips of dried protein that served as training incentives. It was during this break that everything began to accelerate. The silver hatchling, in the loose interval between drills, did something that it had not done in any of the previous 3 weeks of mornings. It walked toward the archway. Not quickly, not with any apparent urgency. Simply with the easy, self-directed movement of a creature that had decided where it wanted to be and was going there, the way a cat crosses a room, not asking permission, not announcing intention, simply moving with the total confidence of an animal that has not yet learned the concept of no. The junior handler on its lead rope stumbled forward, caught off guard by the direction change, and called out a short, surprised sound and tried to redirect. But the silver one's pull was gentle and absolutely firm. The kind of resistance that did not involve force and therefore left force with nothing to push against, and it continued its slow, unhurried course toward the gate. Toward Lyra. She saw it coming and felt the blood leave her face. She could not move, every instinct she possessed was screaming at her to withdraw, to pull back into the servants' corridor, to become the invisible, unremarkable thing she had always been and vanish before the full weight of discovery landed on her, but her feet were not receiving signals. They were rooted to the archway floor as though they had grown there over 3 weeks, as though she had put down something in this spot that she could not simply pick up and carry away. The silver hatchling reached the gate and pressed its nose through the gap between the iron frame and the stone wall, that crooked horn angling sideways to fit, and it looked at Lyra from a distance of less than 3 feet with its pale violet eyes and exhaled a long, slow breath that was warm even across the cold air between them, that smelled of something mineral and ancient and not unpleasant, like sun-warmed stone. Lyra was shaking. She did not know when she had started shaking. She looked at the silver hatchling's face, the scaled ridges above its eyes, the small mobile plates along its jaw, the improbable grace of a feature that was designed for violence and was currently expressing something that looked disturbingly like affection. And she thought very clearly in a thought that arrived with perfect, unhurried certainty. I should have stepped back when I still could. Behind the silver hatchling, across the yard, Master Corvin had turned around. She saw his face change from this distance and through the gap in the gate, and watching it change was like watching weather come in from the sea, the flat advancing front of it, the pressure drop that preceded it, the moment when the light altered and you understood that what was coming had already decided to come, and your own preferences on the matter were entirely irrelevant. He saw the silver hatchling at the gate. He saw the direction of its orientation. He followed the line of it, this time with the gate fully in his view, and his eyes found the archway and he looked directly at Lyra, looked at her with the full focused attention of a man who had just identified the source of a 3-week problem, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he crossed the yard. He walked with the same measured, deliberate stride that he used for everything, but beneath the measure of it was something that ate the frost from the ground and shortened the air. The junior handlers stepped aside for him. The red-black eight shifted, reading the current in the yard the way all creatures read the movements of the most powerful animal in their vicinity. The silver hatchling turned from the gate to watch him come, its posture changing, not to fear, not to that low, pulled-in defensive crouch that fear produced, but to something alert and very still, something that was paying very close attention. Corvin stopped in front of the silver hatchling. He looked at it for a long moment, then he looked past it through the gate at Lyra. She did not run, she could not have said why. Perhaps because running would have confirmed a guilt she was not entirely sure she possessed. Perhaps because the cold hand around her spine had spread outward and reached her legs. Perhaps simply because she had been invisible for so long and been seen so rarely that being seen, even like this, even by the wrong person, even in the worst possible circumstances, struck some deeply worn and hungry part of her as something that she was not willing to immediately reverse. She met his eyes, she held them. Her hands were balled in the fabric of her apron. Corvin stepped away from the silver hatchling and moved toward the gate, and his right hand closed fully around the spinewhip handle and drew it from his belt, and he said, "Who in the name of the crowned flame are you?" His voice was not raised. That was somehow worse than if it had been raised. It carried across the yard and into the archway with the perfect carrying quality of a voice that had spent decades making itself heard above noise and weather, and it landed in Lyra's chest like a stone dropped into deep water, sending rings outward through everything. She opened her mouth. Nothing came. This was the particular cruelty of years of invisibility. It prepared you beautifully for not being seen and prepared you for almost nothing else. Lyra had no practiced answer for being directly addressed by a figure of authority in a place she was not supposed to be. She had no script for this, no rehearsed explanation, no ready-made version of herself that could navigate this moment with competence or grace. She had only the raw, unprocessed fact of her presence, and a throat that had closed around whatever words might have been forming. She watched Corvin take in her silence, and she watched his expression settle into something she recognized from kitchen authority figures and stable masters, and every other person who had ever found an invisible girl in the wrong place. The specific, efficient contempt of someone who has already decided what you are, and simply needs the formality of addressing you before proceeding with what they were always going to do. He lowered the whip, not away from her. Down and toward her, the kind of lowering that was the beginning of a gesture, the weight of the handle shifting to a different kind of readiness. He stepped closer. His shadow fell across the gate. She could see the detail of him now, the frost on the shoulders of his dark green uniform, the deep lines around his eyes, the way his enormous scarred hand held the whip not with the loose ease of habit but with the deliberate grip of intent. "Trespassing in the royal yard is a flogging offense for servants," he said. His voice was still level, still controlled, still carrying that quality of wound tightness that she had noted at the start of the morning. "And you have been, how long exactly has a kitchen girl been disrupting my training sequences?" He took another step forward. "I will be the ones." He raised his hand. The spinewhip drew back, and the yard behind him erupted. It was not the sound that stopped him first, it was the vibration. It came up through the frost-hardened ground in a wave that was felt in the soles of the feet before it was heard by the ears. A deep, resonant collective sound that had no single source, and therefore seemed to have every source at once, as though the yard itself had produced it, as though the stones and the dirt and the cold gray air had all simultaneously decided to speak in a register that bypassed the conscious mind entirely, and arrived directly at the ancient, animal, run-or-die part of the brain. Corvin's arm stopped mid-motion. He turned. Every hatchling in the yard had risen. They stood on their rear legs with their wings spread to their current full span, not enormous yet, but enough to add height and shadow and the abrupt visual fact of creatures that were no longer behaving like trained animals. The 8 red-black hatchlings stood in a loose arc, their amber eyes burning with something that was not the flat, suspicious alertness of their usual morning expressions, but something brighter and harder and far more present. Their weight was forward on their rear haunches, their forelegs raised, their claws extended to their full length and pressing into the frost as though they needed the grip. The silver one stood in front of all of them. It had placed itself between Corvin's raised hand and the archway with a directness of intention that left no room for interpretation, not positioned adjacent to the confrontation, not nearby and agitated, but precisely, exactly, specifically between. Its crooked horn was lowered, not to the ground but forward, at the angle of a creature presenting its point. Its violet eyes were on Corvin with a focus so absolute and so clear that it communicated more than fear and more than aggression. and more than anything that the Spinewhip's training had ever produced. It communicated a decision. The resonant sound was still moving through the ground. It was still moving through the walls. It was moving through Lyra's feet and up her legs and into her chest, and it was the strangest sensation she had ever felt, not frightening, not to her, despite every rational reason it should have been. It felt improbably and completely like being held. Corvin stood with his whip arm still raised and his back to the hatchlings and his face turned toward them now, and Lyra watched the color change in his face from across the gate. Watched 20 years of professional certainty encounter something it had not trained for, something that existed entirely outside the parameters of its experience, and she watched it falter. The Spinewhip did not fall. The morning held its breaths, and from somewhere across the fortress, the sound of running feet began. The hatchlings rose. Time did a strange thing in that moment. It did not stop. Lyra would think about this later in the quiet of many subsequent evenings, trying to reconstruct the sequence with accuracy, trying to separate what had actually happened from what the memory had made of it. Time did not stop. It continued its forward movement with the same indifferent momentum it always maintained, utterly unconcerned with the significance of what was occurring beneath it. But it changed its texture somehow. It thickened. Each second acquired a weight and a density that ordinary seconds did not carry, so that the span of perhaps 30 heartbeats felt inhabited in a way that most minutes never were, felt pressed full of detail and sensation, and a peculiar, almost painful clarity, the way the world sometimes looks in the seconds after a very loud noise when everything has gone suddenly and completely silent. Lyra felt every stone of the archway against her back. She felt the cold of the morning against every exposed inch of skin. She felt the vibration still moving through the ground and up through the soles of her thin shoes and into her legs and her spine and her sternum, that deep collective resonance of 9 young dragons in a state of unified, chosen attention. And she felt it the way she imagined people felt the first note of a very large bell with the whole body at once, before the mind had time to interpret. She felt all of this and she did not move and she did not look away. And across the frost-hardened yard, Master Corvin stood with his whip arm raised and his body half-turned, and his face carrying the expression of a man who had walked through a door he recognized and found an entirely different room on the other side. The running feet grew louder. They were coming from the direction of the upper corridor, the administrative passage that connected the training yard to the warden's offices and the Crown's Dragon Records room, and they carried the particular rhythm of someone moving with urgent purpose rather than panic, someone who had been summoned rather than alarmed. One set of feet measured and fast, the stride of someone who covered ground efficiently without wasting energy on haste for its own sake. Corvin heard them. Lyra saw the slight shift in his attention, the fractional turn of his head toward the upper gate, and watched him make the calculation, the swift internal arithmetic of a man assessing how long he had before the situation acquired a witness. His whip arm was still raised. His hand was still closed around the handle, but something in his posture had begun the slow, almost imperceptible process of reconsidering itself. The hatchlings had not moved. This was the thing that seemed to be costing Corvin the most, not the sound they had made, not the fact of their rising, but the fact that they were staying risen. In his experience, Lyra understood animal displays were self-limiting. A creature raised itself in threat or alarm and then either escalated into action or came back down, driven by the physics of sustained tension and the practical difficulty of holding a threat posture indefinitely. He had seen hatchlings bristle and spread and make noise before. He had always waited it out, and it had always resolved, because young animals tired, and because his 20 years of authority in this yard had always, eventually, reasserted itself like water finding its level. But the Silver One was not tiring, none of them were. They stood with a stillness that was not the stillness of exhaustion or uncertainty, but the stillness of creatures that had arrived somewhere and intended to remain there. And the Silver One's violet eyes were on Corvin with an attention so steady, and so complete that it had moved past the vocabulary of animal behavior entirely and into something that made the skin at the back of Corvin's neck do things that his professional composure was rapidly losing the ability to suppress. The upper gate opened. Thessaly did not enter the yard at speed. She came through the gate the way she did everything, at her own pace, with her own quality of presence, the kind of entrance that did not announce itself and therefore announced everything. She was a small woman, shorter than Lyra, somewhere past 70, with white hair cut close to her head, and a face that had been shaped by decades of weather and attention into something that had passed through handsome and arrived at formidable. She wore the deep blue of the Royal Warden's office, and carried no whip and no staff and no visible instrument of authority, which was itself a kind of authority that made Corvin's spinewhip look like a prop. She had been the Royal Dragon Warden for 31 years. She had bonded her first dragon at the age of 19, a fact recorded in the Crown's archives and occasionally referenced in the academic literature on interspecies bonding, always with a note of qualified astonishment. She had overseen 8 clutches, trained 4 generations of handlers, and written the foundational manual that Corvin himself had studied when he was an apprentice trainer before he had decided he understood dragons better than any manual could convey. She crossed the yard toward the formation of risen hatchlings with her hands loose at her sides and her eyes moving, taking in the 9 animals, their formation, the silver one at the front, the direction of its gaze, Corvin's raised arm and the whip in his hand and the archway at the yard's eastern edge and the girl standing in it. And Lyra watched her face process all of this information in the span of a few seconds and watched understanding settle across it like a tide coming in. Quiet. Complete. Inevitable. Thessaly stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the yard, equidistant between Corvin and the formation of hatchlings, and she was still for a long moment, and then she said in a voice that was entirely conversational, "Lower the whip, Corvin." It was not a command in the way that Corvin's instructions were commands, barked or clipped or weighted with the implication of consequences. It was simply a statement of what was going to happen next, delivered with the calm certainty of someone reading aloud from a document. It left no space for negotiation, not because it threatened to close that space, but because it had arrived having already closed it. Corvin lowered the whips. He did it the way a man does something he disagrees with but has decided not to contest publicly, with a controlled deliberateness that was technically compliance and communicated everything except genuine concession. He looked at Thessaly with the flat expression of a professional who has been interrupted and does not intend to let the interruption stand, and he drew a breath that was the beginning of a sentence. Thessaly held up one hand, not toward him, toward the hatchlings. And she made a sound. It was not a word. Lyra could not have transcribed it or replicated it or described it with any precision afterward. It occupied the same register as the resonance the hatchlings had produced, that low, felt-in-the-chest frequency that bypassed the interpretive mind and went directly to something older and deeper, but shaped somehow. Intentional. A sound that had been made many times by someone who understood what it meant and what it was for, worn smooth by repetition into something that carried both meaning and relationship. The way a word in a private language between 2 people carries more than its literal definition. The hatchlings heard it. Every one of them, all 9 simultaneously, without a beat of delay, shifted. Not into panic or submission or any of the postures that Corvin's training had been working to produce, simply into a different quality of attention. Their wings lowered by increments. Their weight redistributed from the forward urgency of confrontation toward something more settled, more patient, like water adjusting to a new container. The deep vibration in the ground softened but did not stop entirely. It persisted as a kind of undertone, a hum beneath everything, the record of what had happened kept alive in the earth and the stones. The silver one alone did not fully lower its posture. It shifted, responding to Thessaly's sound, its wings coming down by half. But it kept its forward orientation. It kept its crooked horn angled. It kept its violet eyes moving between Corvin and the archway with a quiet, unrelenting persistence that was not aggression and was not fear and was not anything that a training manual had a category for. Thessaly looked at the silver hatchling for a long time. Then she turned and looked at the archway, at Lyra. Being looked at by Thessaly was a different experience from being looked at by Corvin. Corvin's gaze had been prosecutorial, identifying, categorizing, building a case. Thessaly's gaze was something else. It was the gaze of someone who looked at things the way light looks at things, which is to say completely without preference, landing on everything equally and thereby revealing things that selective attention missed. She looked at Lyra standing in the archway with her flower-dusted apron and her linen-pinned hair and her hands fisted in the fabric at her sides. And she looked at the silver hatchling between them, and she looked at the invisible line connecting the two, not a physical thing, not something Lyra could have pointed to and said, "There, that is what I mean," but present, absolutely, in the way that structural things are present in a building, felt in the solidity of the whole without being visible in any single part. Thessaly said nothing for a moment. She simply looked with that complete, unprejudiced attention, and Lyra stood in it and felt, for the first time in her memory, the specific and disorienting sensation of being seen accurately. Not caught, not identified, seen. It was not comfortable. It was also, under the discomfort, something she had no word for but felt in her chest as a loosening, as though something that had been clenched for a very long time had been given permission to consider opening. Thessaly turned back to Corvin. "How long," Thessaly said, "have your morning sessions been running more smoothly than the month prior?" The question was so far from what Corvin had been preparing to say that it visibly derailed him. He blinked once. "I don't see what that." "How long," Thessaly said again, with the patient repetition of someone who has asked a question and genuinely wants the answer and will wait. Corvin's jaw worked briefly. Approximately 3 weeks, he said, in the tone of a man giving information under protest. The hatchlings have been showing improved baseline calm in the early drills. I attributed it to the revised rotation schedule. You attributed it to yourself, Thessaly said, not unkindly, as a statement of fact. You usually do. The silence that followed this was the particular silence of something true landing in a place that was not prepared to receive it. Thessaly moved her attention back to the archway, to Lyra. Come out, she said, not a command either, something quieter than a command, an invitation with the certainty of one who already knew it would be accepted. Lyra's feet moved before her mind gave them the instruction. She crossed the threshold of the archway and stepped onto the frost-hardened dirt of the training yard, and the cold morning air hit her differently here, fuller, somehow more present, the way air feels in open spaces after you have been standing in a corridor. Her shoes crunched lightly against the frost. Every eye in the yard was on her. The junior handlers near the pen gate, wide-eyed and still. The 8 red-black hatchlings, their amber gaze tracking her movement with their characteristic flat suspicion. Corvin, his expression now carrying something complicated and reluctant beneath the residual authority. Thessaly, calm and watchful and entirely without judgment. And the silver one. The silver hatchling had turned to face her the moment she crossed the threshold, and it was watching her approach with its full body, not just its eyes but its entire orientation, the way a compass needle moves to north, with the quality of something that has found the thing it was always calibrated to find. Its posture had completed its shift now, wings fully lowered, weight settled, horn no longer angled in confrontation but raised slightly in the way that a creature raises its head when the thing it has been waiting for arrives. Lyra stopped walking 3 feet from it. She was shaking still, had not stopped shaking since Corvin had raised the whip, could not seem to stop now even in the aftermath, the way a string continues to vibrate after the bow has lifted. She was aware of how she looked, small and cold and flower-dusted and wrong for this place in every visible way. A kitchen girl standing in the middle of the royal training yard surrounded by dragons and authority and consequences she had not yet finished calculating. The silver hatchling crossed the remaining 3 feet between them and pressed the flat of its cheek against her trembling hands. The warmth of it undid her completely. She had imagined in a distant theoretical way that dragon scales would be cold, that they would carry the temperature of the air around them the way stone did, passive and indifferent. But the silver one's scales were warm, not the fierce heat of what dragons would become, not the legendary furnace warmth of adult fire breathers, but the gentle, personal warmth of a living body, of blood and breath, and the specific, irreplaceable warmth of a creature that was choosing to be close to you. It radiated through her palms and into her frozen hands and up her wrists, and she felt it move through her like something she had not known she was waiting for. She curled her fingers very gently against the silver scales. The silver hatchling exhaled that long mineral breath she had first encountered through the gate gap, warm and ancient-smelling, and made a sound that she had never heard it make before. Low, sustained, nothing like the resonant formation sound of the collective rising. Personal. The kind of sound that was not directed outward but simply expressed, the way a person sometimes makes a sound of recognition when they find a thing they have been looking for in the place they expected it to be. Behind her, she heard one of the junior handlers make a short, involuntary sound of surprise. She heard the subtle shift of feet as the 8 red-black hatchlings adjusted their weight and resettled, some collective tension releasing out of the group like air from a held breath. She heard nothing from Corvin. She heard from Thessaly a very small sound, not quite a word, not quite a sigh, that carried in it the compressed weight of someone who has been right about something for a long time and is experiencing the particular bittersweet satisfaction of seeing it confirmed. "What is your name?" Thessaly asked. Lyra had to clear her throat before the answer would come. "Lyra," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended, scraped at the edges by everything the last 20 minutes had put it through. "I work in the kitchens, lower hall. I know I shouldn't have been here. I know it's trespassing. I didn't mean to." She stopped, took a breath. "I just wanted to watch them," she said, and the simplicity of it, the absolute stripped-down truth of it, sounded strange in the open air, strange and very clear. "I just wanted to watch them." Thessaly was quiet for a moment. "How long?" 3 weeks. Every mornings. Every morning I could manage." Thessaly looked at the silver hatchling with its cheek pressed against Lyra's hands and its eyes half closed, and its breath coming in the slow rhythmic measure of a creature in a state of deep and chosen calm. And then she looked at the 8 red-black hatchlings behind it, who had lowered themselves entirely now, who were sitting in a loose arrangement that bore, Lyra realized with a start, a structural resemblance to the territory hold formation Corvin had been drilling them on all week. Except that they had arrived at it themselves, without a command, without a whip crack, simply because the state of the yard had settled into something that made it the natural thing to do. "You didn't touch them," Thessaly said. It was not a question. No, you didn't fade them. No, you didn't call to them or try to attract their attention. Lyra shook her head. I just stood there, I was just there. Thessaly made that almost sound again, that compressed and complicated quiet. Then she turned fully to Corvin, and her expression had completed its transition from assessment into something that had a definite shape and a definite direction, and it was not a shape or direction that offered Corvin any comfort. What followed was not a scene. Thessaly was not a woman who made scenes. What followed was a conversation, held in voices too low for Lyra to hear from where she stood with the silver hatchling's warmth in her hands, and it lasted perhaps 4 minutes. And at the end of those 4 minutes, Corvin's face had gone through several expressions that his professional composure was clearly struggling to contain. And when it was over, he clipped the spine whip back to his belt with a deliberateness that had the quality of a period at the end of a sentence, and walked toward the upper gate with his measured stride and went through it, and the yard fell into a silence that felt, immediately and completely, different from the silence it had held while he was in it. Lighter was not quite the word, more spacious perhaps, as though the yard had discovered it had more room in it than had been apparent before. The junior handlers looked at each other. The 8 red-black hatchlings looked at the gate through which Corvin had departed, and then looked at each other, and then gradually, with the pragmatic adaptability of young creatures, began to do the things young creatures do when supervision has been temporarily suspended, investigating the frost patterns on the ground, nosing at each other's flanks. Discovering that one patch of dirt near the water trough was slightly warmer than the surrounding ground, and establishing a small collective argument over who had rights to it. The silver one stayed where it was. Its eyes were open now, watching Lyra's face with that particular quality of attention she had grown to know over 3 weeks, not demanding, not performing, simply present in the specific way that made her feel that being looked at this way was not an intrusion but a form of recognition. She looked back, her hands were no longer shaking. Thessaly came and stood beside her, and for a moment the two of them were simply there together, the old warden and the kitchen girl, looking at the silver hatchling in the gray morning light. You know what a bond is, Thessaly said. Not a question, it had the quality of something established rather than asked. Lyra hesitated. I've heard the word in the old stories. The old stories get most of it wrong, Thessaly said. They describe it as something dramatic, a moment of fire and declaration and mutual transformation, something witnessed and recorded and commemorated. She paused. In my experience, bonds rarely announce themselves. They accumulate quietly over time, through the simple repeated fact of presence and attention offered freely without agenda. She looked at the silver hatchling. By the time you realize one has formed, it has usually been there for longer than you knew. Lyra absorbed this. 3 weeks, she said quietly. At least, Thessaly said. The silver one huffed a small breath against Lyra's knuckles, warm and deliberate. What happens now? Lyra asked. Thessaly was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that was not the absence of an answer but the assembling of one. Around them the yard was alive with the sounds of 8 young dragons conducting their own affairs, small scales rustling, low vocalizations, the occasional punctuation of a short wingspread, and over it all the persistent low undertone that had been there since the hatchlings rose, softer now but unextinguished, the sonic record of a choice made and maintained. What happens now, Thessaly said, is what has already been happening, continued and acknowledged and given the space it requires. She turned to look at Lyra directly with those seeing eyes, that light-like attention that landed on everything equally. You will need a place to sleep that is closer to the pens. You will need proper clothes for outdoor work and a record book for your observations. You have been making observations, I expect, even if you haven't been writing them down. Lyra thought of the mental catalog she had been compiling without nomming it, that the silver one's morning rituals, the hierarchy of the 8, the particular sounds they made for different things, the way the formation drills performed differently on cold days versus mild ones. Yes, she said, I have. Good, unwritten observations are still observations. We will find them together. Thessaly paused. You will also need a name for the silver one. The name in the training ledger is unsuitable. It was chosen for filing purposes, not for relationship. Lyra looked at the silver hatchling, at the crooked horn and the pale scales and the violet eyes that were watching her with that settled, patient, entirely specific attention, the attention of a creature that had decided sometime in the last 3 weeks that she was worth waiting for, worth turning toward, worth rising for. A name arrived in her the way true names arrived, not chosen so much as recognized, the way you recognize a face you have seen before in a different context, the sudden click of rightness. Ren, she said. The silver hatchling made the low personal sound again. Recognition, acceptance, the sound of something answered. They gave her a cot near the eastern pen that same day. dragged in by one of the junior handlers under Thessaly's quiet direction, and placed against the wall where the stone held the warmth from the pens on the other side. It was a better cot than the one she had left in the kitchen dormitory, the mattress firmer, the blanket thicker, the pillow not entirely flat, and she sat on the edge of it that first evening with the leather record book Thessaly had found for her open across her knees and a short stub of writing charcoal in her rough and cracked hand, and she thought about where to begin. She began in the end at the beginning. 3 weeks ago, the wrong turn, the smell of something alive, the archway and the pale scales catching the early light and the violet eyes finding her through the gate gap with an immediacy that had felt like being called by name. She wrote it plainly in the functional, unpracticed handwriting of someone self-taught, without decoration or apology, because it was true and it had happened, and it was the origin of something and origins deserve to be recorded. From the pen on the other side of the wall, she heard Wren's breathing, steady, deep, the slow, rhythmic breath of a creature at rest and at ease, and the sound of it moved through the stone and into the room and into her chest, and settled there like something that had finally found its correct location after a long time of being elsewhere. She wrote until the stub of charcoal was too short to hold. Then she set the book on the small table beside the cot and lay back on the firm mattress and looked at the stone ceiling of the eastern pen quarters and listened to Wren breathing on the other side of the wall. She was not invisible here. She was not invisible here, and the sky had not fallen and no disaster had arrived. And the morning that had broken everything open had deposited her not in ruin, but in this room, with this cot and this record book and the warm, persistent sound of a silver dragon breathing in the dark. She thought about Thessaly's words. By the time you realize one has formed, it has usually been there for longer than you knew. She thought about the 3 weeks of mornings, the cold archway, the counting of heartbeats, the flower on her apron and the frost on the ground, and the violet eyes finding her through the gate gap with the same simple, reliable certainty as sunrise. She thought about what it meant to be chosen, not by ceremony or decree or the machinery of official selection, but by the slow accumulated weight of mornings, by presents freely offered and presents freely returned, by the quiet revolutionary act of two creatures seeing each other clearly and deciding, without drama and without an audience, that they were going to keep doing so. She closed her eyes. Outside, the Thornmere wind moved through the fortress, and the torch flames laned and righted themselves, and the night settled over Ashenvale with its usual indifferent authority. And in the eastern pen, Wren breathed on, steady and warm and entirely present. And Lyra, for the first time in as long as she could remember, slept without dreaming of somewhere else.